A millionaire attempted to degrade his loyal maid in front of powerful friends. Her reaction changed how everyone saw him forever. The Grayson estate, with its sprawling lawns and grand marble columns, seemed timeless in its majesty. Every brick, every gilded frame, whispered wealth and power. But tonight, beneath the estate's veneer of perfection, something far less polished brewed. Inside Dylan Grayson's vast office, the air was thick with tension, the silence punctuated only by the ticking of a grandfather clock. A solitary desk lamp cast long, uneven shadows across the room, making the polished surfaces of the oak desk gleam like a mirage in the dim light. Clara stood at the edge of the room, her posture composed but her knuckles whitening as she gripped the strap of her worn leather handbag. It was the only thing out of place in this meticulously curated space, a testament to her years of quiet service to the Grayson family. She waited, poised but uneasy, as Dylan flicked through a stack of papers without sparing her a glance. When he finally spoke, his voice cut through the room like a blade. "Do you know why I called you here, Clara?" She inhaled sharply, willing her voice to remain steady. "No, sir. I assumed you'd tell me." Dylan's eyes lifted, locking onto hers. They were the eyes of a man used to control, every movement calculated, every word precise. His expression was unreadable, a mask he had perfected over years of boardroom battles and high-stakes negotiations. Clara, who had worked under his roof for over 5 years, knew this look well. It was the look he wore before delivering bad news. "I've been hearing things," Dylan began, his tone deceptively calm. He leaned back in his chair, tapping his fingers against the polished wood. "Whispers. Rumors. Do you know what kind of rumors I'm talking about?" "No, sir," Clara replied, the first stirrings of panic crawling up her spine. "I've always done my job." "Don't," Dylan interrupted, his voice rising just enough to cut her off. "Don't give me the loyalty speech. I don't have time for platitudes tonight." Clara flinched slightly but stood her ground. The weight of his accusation hung heavy in the air, unspoken yet palpable. She had spent years in his service, learning every rhythm of the Grayson household, anticipating his needs before he voiced them. She had never imagined her loyalty would be questioned. Not like this. "Leaks," Dylan said finally, the word tumbling out like an indictment. "Sensitive information about my business dealings has made its way into the hands of people who shouldn't have it. And you, Clara, you've had access to things most people in this house wouldn't dream of." Her heart sank. "You think I'm the one who?" Dylan stood abruptly, rounding the desk to stand just a few feet from her. His presence loomed, commanding, as he folded his arms. "Who else could it be? You've been in this house, around my papers, my meetings. You've overheard conversations. The timing of these leaks isn't a coincidence." Clara's lips parted, words of defense bubbling to the surface, but something in his gaze stopped her. It wasn't just anger she saw, it was doubt. For the first time in all her years of service, she realized Dylan wasn't just angry at her. He was angry at himself. "Mr. Grayson," she said softly, her voice trembling just enough to betray the hurt she tried to suppress, "I would never betray you. I've given everything to this job, to this house, and I've given you everything in return." Dylan snapped, his voice echoing against the vaulted ceiling. "But maybe I've been too generous. Maybe I've let loyalty blind me." The words stung more than Clara expected, and for a moment, she struggled to find her voice. "What do you want me to say? That I'm not the one who leaked your secrets? That I haven't betrayed you? Because it's the truth, Mr. Grayson. I swear it." But Dylan wasn't listening. He had already made his decision. "I can't afford to take chances," he said, turning his back to her and staring out the large bay window overlooking the estate. His reflection in the glass was sharp, almost distorted by the dim light. "You're dismissed, Clara." Effective immediately. The finality in his tone left no room for negotiation. Clara's breath caught in her throat, her pulse pounding in her ears. She wanted to plead her case, to demand he listen to reason, but the words died in her throat. This wasn't the Dylan Grayson she had worked for all these years. This was someone else, someone hardened, consumed by suspicion. "Is there nothing I can do to change your mind?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "No," Dylan replied, his gaze fixed on the dark horizon. "The decision's been made." A heavy silence filled the room, thicker than the shadows. Clara turned on her heel and walked toward the door, her steps slow and deliberate, each one feeling like the closing of a chapter she hadn't wanted to end. As she passed through the grand hallways for the last time, memories of her years at the estate flickered like distant echoes. The staff's laughter in the kitchen, the quiet dawn spent preparing for another day of service, the rare moments when Dylan's exterior softened, revealing glimpses of the man beneath the businessman. Outside, the night air hit her like a slap. It was cool and biting, a stark contrast to the oppressive warmth of the house. She paused at the edge of the estate, turning to take one last look at the mansion. It loomed like a fortress, silent and impenetrable, guarding secrets she had once felt privy to. But now, she realized, she had never truly been part of this world. She had merely existed on its fringes. With a deep breath, Clara walked away, her resolve hardening with each step. She had been discarded, yes, but she wasn't broken. Not yet. Inside, Dylan remained by the window, watching her silhouette disappear into the night. For a brief moment, something flickered in his expression. Regret, perhaps, or doubt. But he quickly buried it, turning back to his desk with a resolute expression. He had made the right decision. He had to believe that. Yet, as he tried to focus on the papers before him, the words blurred into meaningless shapes. The house felt quieter, emptier than ever before. And for the first time in years, Dylan Grayson felt a pang of something foreign and unwelcome. Guilt. The dawn broke gently over the Grayson estate, yet its golden hues failed to touch the gloom that hung in Dylan Grayson's study. The fire in the hearth crackled softly, but its warmth did little to dispel the coldness he felt in his chest. Sitting at the head of the vast dining table, untouched coffee cooling beside him, Dylan's mind replayed the events of the previous night like a broken record. Clara was gone. Dismissed. Justified, he told himself for the 100th time. She had betrayed his trust, or so he believed. Yet the silence of the estate this morning, an absence he hadn't anticipated, gnawed at him. No faint clinking of teacups being prepared, no soft murmur of her voice instructing the staff. Instead, only a deafening quiet. But it wasn't the quiet that unsettled him most. It was the news. "Sir," Robert, his ever-efficient assistant, interrupted Dylan's thoughts, cautiously stepping into the study. His expression was taut, his fingers gripping the edges of a tablet. "There's something you need to see." Dylan raised an eyebrow, motioning for Robert to continue. He took the tablet, his eyes scanning the screen. The headline leapt out like a slap to the face. Grayson's trusted maid spotted at Elliot Mark's estate. He froze, the tablet trembling slightly in his hands as he stared at the image below. There was Clara, unmistakably poised and calm, stepping out of a sleek black limousine in front of his most notorious rival's home. She was dressed simply, her features partially obscured by dark sunglasses, but the confident set of her jaw made her unmistakable. "Marks," Dylan hissed under his breath, his grip tightening around the edges of the tablet. His greatest adversary in business, a man who had spent years trying to outmaneuver and humiliate him, was now entangled with Clara. The very idea sent a surge of anger boiling in his chest. "She didn't go in," Robert offered hesitantly, his voice soft. "The report says she was only seen at the gates." Dylan's head snapped up, his glare cutting through the assistant. "And yet, there she is. In his limousine. At his estate." His words were sharp, laced with disbelief. "Tell me, Robert, what kind of loyalty does that show?" Robert took a careful step back, sensing the storm brewing in his employer. "I can dig deeper, sir. Find out what she was doing there, who arranged it." "Do that," Dylan barked, tossing the tablet onto his desk. The sharp clatter echoed through the room as he stood abruptly, pacing the length of the study. His thoughts churned with possibilities, each more damning than the last. Had Clara gone to Elliot willingly? Had she been playing both sides all along? Or was this some elaborate move orchestrated by Marks to rattle him? His jaw clenched as the last possibility took root in his mind. If Elliot had Clara now, What could he possibly want from her? Dylan's world had been meticulously curated, every detail controlled and protected. But this felt personal, strategic. It's a game, he realized grimly, and Clara is the perfect pawn. Meanwhile, across town, Clara stepped out of the limousine and stood at the wrought iron gates of Elliot Marks' estate. The sprawling property mirrored the grandeur of Dylan's, but where the Grayson mansion exuded old-world elegance, Elliot's home was sharp, modern, almost sterile in its perfection. The two men couldn't have been more different, and yet their power and influence tied them inextricably together. The driver of the limousine, a quiet man with graying hair, glanced at her in the rearview mirror. "Do you want me to wait, ma'am?" "No," Clara replied firmly. Her voice was calm, her face expressionless, but her hands trembled as she adjusted the strap of her handbag. "This won't take long." The driver gave a small nod and drove off, leaving Clara standing alone. She hesitated for only a moment before striding toward the intercom. The security cameras mounted on the gate followed her movements, their unblinking gaze unnerving. She pressed the button and waited. Moments later, a crackling voice answered. "State your name and business." "Clara Montgomery," she replied, her tone even. "Mr. Marks is expecting me." The gates creaked open without further question, and Clara walked up the paved driveway, the towering house looming closer with each step. Her heart pounded against her ribs, but her expression remained resolute. She had been summoned, and she had come, not by choice, but necessity. Inside, Elliot Marks watched her approach from his study window. A satisfied smirk tugged at the corners of his lips as he swirled the amber liquid in his glass. "Right on time," he murmured to himself. He turned to his assistant, seated nearby with a tablet. "She's nervous. Good. That'll make this easier." The assistant hesitated. "Are you sure about this, sir?" Pushing her is exactly the point," Elliot interrupted smoothly, setting the glass down and adjusting his cuffs. "Grayson thinks he's untouchable. But Clara's the key to showing him otherwise." By the time Dylan received word that Clara had left Elliot's estate, he had worked himself into a frenzy. The image of her at the gates, the confident tilt of her chin, burned in his mind like an accusation. "She didn't go inside," Robert repeated, as if trying to temper his employer's rage. "She was there less than 15 minutes. And what, precisely, could have been accomplished in those 15 minutes? Dylan snapped, pacing his study. A delivery? A message? Or perhaps she didn't need to stay because she's already been feeding him information for weeks. "You don't know that," Robert countered cautiously. "We don't know anything for sure yet." Dylan stopped, turning to face his assistant with a steely glare. "Then find out. Because until I know exactly what she was doing there, Clara Montgomery is no longer just an ex-employee. She's a problem." But even as he issued the command, a pang of doubt tugged at him. Clara had worked for him loyally for years. Could she really have betrayed him so thoroughly? Or was he missing something? Some vital piece of the puzzle that Elliot Marks now held? One thing was certain. Whatever Clara's involvement, the game had begun. And Dylan Grayson wasn't about to lose. The evening descended quietly over the Grayson estate, the kind of quiet that felt oppressive rather than peaceful. Dylan sat alone in his study, the faint glow of his computer screen casting sharp shadows across his face. The photo of Clara stepping out of Elliot's limousine was still pulled up, the pixels mocking him with every glance. He tried to focus on the reports in front of him, documents he had ordered to uncover the source of the leaks, but his mind kept returning to Clara. Her betrayal, if it was a betrayal, felt like a jagged edge he couldn't smooth over. The knock on the door broke his reverie. "Come in," Dylan called, his voice sharper than he intended. Robert stepped in, his expression cautious, as though bracing for a storm. He carried a small manila folder, its contents hidden but clearly significant. "Sir, I've been digging into Clara's movements over the last week, as you requested." "And?" Dylan demanded, leaning back in his chair, trying to appear disinterested though his heart raced with anticipation. Robert hesitated, then placed the folder on the desk. "You'll want to see this for yourself." Dylan flipped it open, his eyes scanning the reports and images. A pattern began to emerge, a trail of phone calls, meetings, and transactions that didn't align with the woman he thought he knew. Most curious was the frequency of her interactions with individuals tied to Mark's operations. Each connection seemed to tighten the noose around her credibility. "She's been busy," Dylan muttered, his voice heavy with bitterness. "There's more," Robert said, stepping closer. One of our security staff overheard Clara on a phone call the day before her dismissal. She was upset. Mentioned something about not having a choice. Dylan's brow furrowed. Not having a choice? What the hell does that mean? Robert shifted uncomfortably. "It could mean a lot of things, sir. But it doesn't sound like someone willingly conspiring." Dylan tapped a finger against the desk, his frustration mounting. This new piece of the puzzle didn't fit with the image of Clara he'd been constructing. If she wasn't acting out of malice, then why was she involved with Marks at all? And why hadn't she come to him first? Meanwhile, across town, Clara sat in a small cafe, a steaming cup of tea untouched before her. Her fingers traced the rim of the porcelain cup as she stared out the window, watching the city bustle past. Her mind was a whirlwind of thoughts, none of them comforting. The conversation with Marks replayed in her head, each word a reminder of the tightrope she was walking. He had offered her a way out, a deal that promised safety but demanded loyalty in return. Clara hadn't agreed, not fully, but she had played along just enough to buy herself time. Time for what? She wondered, the weight of her predicament pressing heavily on her chest. She had spent years building a life of quiet dignity, only to see it unravel in a matter of days. Her phone buzzed on the table, pulling her from her thoughts. She glanced at the screen and hesitated before answering. "Hello? You're not backing out," Elliot Marks' voice came through, smooth and confident. "I hope I made myself clear on that." Clara gritted her teeth. "You don't own me, Elliot." "Not yet," he replied, the smirk evident in his tone. "But let's not pretend you have many options. Dylan threw you out like yesterday's trash. I'm offering you a chance to stay relevant. And at what cost?" She shot back, her voice low but steady. "Betraying the only life I've known?" Marks laughed softly. "That life is over, Clara. Dylan made sure of that. Now it's time to think about yourself for once. Or do you still feel some misplaced loyalty to a man who discarded you without a second thought?" Clara didn't respond immediately. She hated how his words struck a chord, how they echoed doubts she was trying to suppress. Finally, she said, "I'll think about it." "Do that," Mark said before the line went dead. She set the phone down, her hands trembling slightly. Whatever game Marks was playing, she was determined not to let him win. But she also couldn't shake the feeling that Dylan had already lost, not just a trusted employee, but something far more important, her faith in him. Back at the Grayson estate, Dylan's investigation began to take a darker turn. The more he delved into Clara's supposed betrayal, the more inconsistencies he uncovered. The leaks had started months ago, but the timing didn't align with any significant changes in Clara's behavior. In fact, some of the most damaging information had been released while she was away on errands, or during moments when her access was limited. "It doesn't make sense," Dylan muttered to himself, pacing the length of his study. He stopped at the window, staring out at the meticulously maintained gardens. If Clara isn't the leak, then who is? The question hung in the air, unanswered but persistent. Dylan's mind reeled as he considered the possibility that someone else, someone still within his inner circle, might be the real culprit. Later that night, Clara returned to her modest apartment, her steps heavy with exhaustion. The day had been long, filled with whispered conversations and tense silences, but she wasn't ready to give up. She sank onto the couch, pulling a small notebook from her bag. Inside were pages of scribbled notes, details she had pieced together over weeks of quiet observation. One name stood out among the rest: Jordan, Dylan's closest associate and trusted confidant. Clara had noticed him lurking in the background more often than usual, his presence almost too convenient during moments of crisis. And then there were the phone calls she had overheard, his hushed tones suggesting conversations meant to stay hidden. "Jordan," she murmured, the name tasting bitter on her tongue. "What are you hiding?" She didn't have all the answers yet, but she knew one thing for certain. If Dylan thought she was the enemy, he was looking in the wrong direction. The grand ballroom of the Five Seasons Hotel gleamed under the golden light of its sprawling chandeliers. The space was a testament to luxury: polished marble floors, cascading floral arrangements, and the hum of soft jazz music weaving through the murmur of polite conversation. It was the kind of event where the city's elite gathered to flaunt their wealth and power under the guise of philanthropy. Dylan Grayson stood near the bar, his grip tight around a glass of whiskey he hadn't touched. His tailored suit was immaculate, his stance commanding, but his mind was far from the charity gala. His eyes scanned the room with precision, searching for the one man who occupied his thoughts more than the flashing cameras or the glittering crowd. Elliot Marks. It had been days since the damning photo of Clara at Elliot's estate had surfaced, and Dylan's frustration had only grown. The more he unraveled the supposed betrayal, the more questions he found. And tonight, Dylan knew, was his chance to get answers. Across the room, Elliot stood in a circle of admirers, laughing easily as though he didn't have a care in the world. He wore his signature smirk, the one that made it impossible to tell whether he was charming or condescending. Dylan's jaw tightened as their eyes met briefly across the sea of guests. Elliot raised his glass in a subtle, mocking toast, the challenge clear. Dylan downed his drink and placed the empty glass on the bar with more force than necessary. His pulse quickened as he crossed the room, his movements deliberate. He felt the eyes of the crowd lingering on him, sensing the tension that always seemed to follow him and Elliot into the same space. "Elliot," Dylan greeted, his voice calm but edged with steel. A moment. Elliot turned to face him fully, a practiced smile lighting up his face. "Dylan, I was starting to think you'd avoid me all night. Care for a drink?" "I didn't come for pleasantries," Dylan replied flatly, his tone cutting through the noise of the room. "Let's talk. Privately." A ripple of curiosity passed through the surrounding group, but Elliot, ever the showman, merely chuckled and placed a hand on Dylan's shoulder. "Of course," he said, leading him toward a quieter alcove near the edge of the ballroom. As they walked, Dylan could feel his irritation mounting. Elliot's casual demeanor only stoked the fire of his anger. Once they were out of earshot, Dylan wasted no time. "What are you doing with Clara?" Elliot leaned against the wall, folding his arms across his chest. His smile didn't waver. "Ah, Clara," he said, as if savoring the name. "Quite the topic of conversation these days, isn't she?" "Don't play games with me, Marks," Dylan snapped, his voice low but brimming with barely restrained fury. "Why was she at your estate? What do you want from her?" Elliot tilted his head, pretending to think. "What do I want from her? Nothing she hasn't already offered, I assure you." Dylan's fists clenched at his sides. "You're lying." "Am I?" Elliot asked, his smile sharpening into something crueler. "Tell me, Dylan, why do you care so much? You fired her, didn't you? Cast her aside without so much as a second thought. So why are you so desperate to know what she's doing now?" Dylan opened his mouth to respond, but Elliot cut him off, his tone dropping. "You're not mad because she went to me. You're mad because she didn't come back to you." The words hit harder than Dylan cared to admit, and Elliot's smirk widened, sensing the impact. "You think I stole her away, but the truth is, Dylan, you handed her to me. You practically gift-wrapped her." "Enough," Dylan barked, taking a step closer, his voice dangerous. "If you're trying to provoke me, it won't work. Just tell me what you want." Elliot straightened, his playful demeanor slipping for a moment. "Fine," he said, his voice quieter now, more measured. "Clara came to me because you left her no other choice. She didn't ask to be part of this game, Dylan. You put her in it the moment you doubted her." Dylan's brow furrowed, his mind racing. "What are you talking about?" "She didn't betray you," Elliot said simply, his gaze steady. "But you made her feel like she did. You made her feel like she was nothing." Dylan's chest tightened, the weight of those words settling heavily on him. But Elliot wasn't finished. "You think Clara is your enemy," Elliot continued. "She's not. If anything, she's been cleaning up your mess while you've been too busy looking for someone to blame." Dylan stared at him, the fury in his chest now replaced with a gnawing doubt. "Then why was she with you? Why the limousine? The spectacle?" Elliot shrugged. Because I made sure she had nowhere else to go. And because I wanted you to see her there, to make you question everything. Call it strategy. You used her, Dylan said, his voice low, his hands curling into fists. And you didn't? Elliot countered sharply. You dismissed her like she was disposable. I just picked up the pieces. The truth of those words hit Dylan harder than any blow. Clara hadn't been the one conspiring against him. She had been a casualty of his own paranoia and Elliot's manipulations. Before Dylan could respond, Elliot stepped closer, his voice dropping to a whisper. You want my advice, Dylan? Stop chasing ghosts and start fixing what's broken. If you're lucky, Clara might still be willing to help you. With that, Elliot turned and walked away, leaving Dylan standing alone, the weight of their conversation pressing down on him. Around him, the gala continued, the laughter and music a stark contrast to the turmoil raging inside him. Dylan's mind swirled with questions, but one thing was clear. He needed to find Clara. He needed the truth, her truth. And perhaps, just as Elliot suggested, he needed her more than he realized. The rain fell in steady sheets as Dylan Grayson's car pulled into the parking lot of a modest diner on the outskirts of the city. The headlights cut through the gloom, briefly illuminating the silhouette of a man waiting under the eaves. The driver opened Dylan's door, and he stepped out, his coat shielding him from the downpour. The man he was meeting, the limousine chauffeur, was a far cry from the polished circles Dylan was used to. He had the weary posture of someone who had seen too much of the world and none of its kindness. His graying hair was slicked back from the rain, and his hands were shoved deep into the pockets of a worn jacket. Mr. Grayson, the chauffeur greeted, his voice low and gravelly. He glanced nervously around the parking lot, as if expecting someone to be watching. You said you wanted to talk? Dylan nodded and motioned toward the diner. Inside, the diner was nearly empty, save for a waitress who barely glanced at them as they took a corner booth. The smell of stale coffee and fried food hung in the air, but Dylan's focus was singular. The man across from him fidgeted with his cup, his unease palpable. I'll get straight to the point, Dylan began, leaning forward. His tone was calm, but his eyes were sharp. You drove Clara Montgomery to Elliot Mark's estate. I need to know everything about that day. The chauffeur hesitated, his fingers tightening around the mug. Look, Mr. Grayson, I don't usually get involved in whatever it is you're dealing with. I just drive the car. I'm not asking for your involvement, Dylan said, his voice edged with steel. I'm asking for the truth, and I'm willing to make it worth your while. The man's eyes flicked up, meeting Dylan's intense gaze. He sighed heavily and set the cup down. All right, he said, his voice softening. I'll tell you what I know. But you didn't hear it from me. Dylan gestured for him to continue, his patience thinning. Clara didn't seem happy to be there, the chauffeur began. She got in the car looking tense, nervous, even, kept fidgeting with her bag, like she was carrying something heavy, even though it didn't look like much. What did she say? Dylan pressed. Not much, the man admitted. She was quiet most of the ride, but I overheard her talking on the phone. She said something about not having a choice. Dylan stiffened, the words striking a chord. He had heard them before, from Robert's report and now here. Did she say why? No, the chauffeur said quickly, shaking his head. But she sounded upset, like she was being forced into something she didn't want to do. Dylan's jaw tightened as he processed the information. Clara hadn't gone to Elliot willingly. The picture that had so enraged him, the one that made him believe she had betrayed him, wasn't what it seemed. What happened when you arrived at Mark's estate? Dylan asked, his tone softening slightly. The chauffeur hesitated again, as if weighing his words. She asked me to drop her at the front gate. Didn't want to go inside. She stayed there for a few minutes, made a call, and then told me to drive her back. She didn't go inside? Dylan repeated, his brow furrowing. No, sir, the man confirmed. She barely even looked at the place. A knot of guilt began to form in Dylan's chest. Clara hadn't walked into the lion's den as a willing participant. If anything, she had been standing at the gate, caught between two worlds. Did she say anything else on the way back? Dylan asked, though he wasn't sure he wanted to know. Just that she didn't trust him, the chauffeur replied. Marks, said she wasn't going to let him win, whatever that means. The knot tightened. Clara hadn't been working against him. If anything, she had been fighting her own battle, one he had been too blind to see. Back at the Grayson estate, Dylan poured himself a drink and stared out at the rain-soaked gardens. The chauffeur's confession had turned his assumptions on their head. Clara hadn't betrayed him. She had been forced into a corner, and instead of protecting her, Dylan had pushed her out, leaving her vulnerable to someone like Elliot Marks. His thoughts drifted to the words he had overheard. Not having a choice. What could Clara have meant? What had Marks done to back her into such a position? For the first time in days, doubt began to creep in. Had he let his paranoia destroy the one person who had been truly loyal to him? He set his glass down, his mind racing. There was still too much he didn't know, but one thing was clear. Clara wasn't the enemy, and if she wasn't, then someone else was. At her apartment, Clara sat at her kitchen table, the notebook in front of her filled with scribbled notes and connections she had been piecing together for weeks. One name kept resurfacing, Jordan, Dylan's trusted confidant, the man who had been by his side for years. Clara had always found him charming, but lately, she had seen something darker lurking beneath his polished exterior. She flipped to a fresh page and wrote his name at the top. Jordan had access to the same information she had, if not more. He had the motive, ambition, greed, or perhaps revenge, and he had the opportunity. Dylan's trust in him had always been absolute, which made him the perfect suspect. Clara's phone buzzed, pulling her from her thoughts. She hesitated before answering. "Hello? It's Dylan." The sound of his voice sent a wave of mixed emotions through her. Anger, relief, and something she couldn't quite name. "What do you want?" she asked, her tone guarded. "We need to talk," Dylan said, his voice quieter than she expected. "I know I've made mistakes, but I think there's more going on than either of us realized." Clara was silent for a moment, weighing her options. Finally, she said, "Meet me tomorrow. The cafe on 8th Street. Noon." Dylan agreed, and the line went dead. Clara exhaled, her hands trembling slightly. Tomorrow, she would face him, but not as the woman he had fired. Tomorrow, she would demand the truth and offer her own in return. The cafe on 8th Street was a modest establishment, its vintage decor offering a warmth that contrasted with the cold drizzle outside. Clara arrived first, choosing a corner booth where she could see the entrance, but remained somewhat shielded from the prying eyes of other patrons. She sat with her hands wrapped around a steaming cup of tea, her thoughts as tangled as the rain-slicked streets outside. When the bell above the door jingled, she looked up to see Dylan enter, his tall figure cutting a commanding presence even in the casual setting. His sharp suit seemed out of place here, but it was unmistakably him, controlled, precise, and yet, as he approached, there was something unfamiliar in his expression. Regret? Humility? She couldn't tell. "Clara," he greeted as he reached her table, his voice quieter than she expected. "Dylan," she replied, gesturing for him to sit. "You're on time. I wasn't sure if you'd show up." "I wasn't sure you'd want me to," he admitted, sliding into the seat across from her. His tone carried a rare vulnerability, one that caught her off guard. They sat in silence for a moment, the sound of the rain outside mingling with the soft murmur of conversations around them. It was Dylan who finally broke the quiet. "I owe you an apology," he began, his hands resting on the table, fingers interlocked. "I acted out of fear and mistrust, and I see now that I was wrong." Clara arched an eyebrow, her gaze steady. "You're just realizing that now?" His jaw tightened slightly, but he nodded. "I am, and I want to make it right." "Do you?" Clara leaned back in her seat, crossing her arms. "Because throwing me out of the only home I've known for years doesn't feel like something you can just make right." Her words stung, but Dylan held her gaze, refusing to shy away from the truth. "You're right. I can't undo what I've done, but I've learned some things. Things that make me question everything I thought I knew." Clara leaned forward slightly, her curiosity piqued despite herself. "What things?" Dylan hesitated, as if weighing how much to reveal. Finally, he said, "I've been looking into the leaks. The timing doesn't add up, Clara. They started long before any of this. And the more I dig, the more it seems like someone else has been pulling the strings. She studied him carefully, her defenses still high but her resolve softening slightly. What are you saying? I'm saying I don't think you're the one who betrayed me, Dylan replied, his voice steady. And I need your help to figure out who did. Clara blinked, surprised by his admission. For a moment, she didn't respond, the weight of his words settling over her like a heavy cloak. You need my help? She repeated, her tone incredulous. Yes, Dylan said firmly. You were always the one who noticed things, the one who understood the rhythms of the house better than anyone. If there's someone close to me who's been selling me out, I can't find them without you. Clara's eyes narrowed slightly. You want me to come back? After everything? I want to fix this, Dylan said simply. I don't know how else to say it. The rain had stopped by the time they left the cafe, the gray clouds giving way to patches of pale blue sky. Dylan walked beside Clara, their steps slow, the tension between them still palpable but beginning to ease. You said you've learned things, Clara said, breaking the silence. What have you found? Dylan hesitated, glancing at her before speaking. There's a name that keeps coming up. Jordan. Clara's heart skipped a beat. She had suspected him for weeks, but hearing Dylan confirm it made her stomach twist. Jordan? She asked, keeping her tone neutral. Your right-hand man? Dylan nodded, his expression grim. He's had access to everything. My schedules, my finances, my personal life. At first, I couldn't believe it, but there are too many coincidences to ignore. Clara felt a surge of vindication, but it was quickly tempered by caution. Do you have proof? Not yet, Dylan admitted, but I'm close, and I think you might be able to help me get it. They stopped at the corner of the street, the hum of traffic filling the space between them. Clara turned to face him fully, her expression unreadable. If I help you, it's on my terms, she said firmly. No more orders, no more accusations. If you want me back, you have to trust me completely. Dylan nodded without hesitation. Agreed. Clara studied him for a moment, searching his face for any sign of deception. When she found none, she extended her hand. All right, Dylan, let's find out the truth. He took her hand, the gesture more symbolic than practical, but it carried the weight of a new understanding between them. Later that evening, Clara sat in her apartment, her notebook open on the table in front of her. She scribbled down everything she could remember about Jordan, his habits, his movements, his interactions with the staff. She thought about the times she had seen him lingering in the background, the way his eyes always seemed to be watching, calculating. Dylan's words echoed in her mind. I think you might be able to help me get proof. Clara tapped her pen against the page, her mind racing. If Jordan was the real traitor, then he had to have left a trail. And Clara, more than anyone, knew how to find it. At the Grayson estate, Dylan sat alone in his study, the weight of the day pressing heavily on him. The possibility that Jordan, a man he had trusted implicitly for years, could be the one betraying him was almost too much to bear. But Dylan had learned the hard way that trust could be a dangerous luxury. He picked up his phone and dialed Clara's number. When she answered, her voice was calm but firm. What is it? I've been thinking, he said, his tone thoughtful. If Jordan is the one behind this, we'll need to catch him in the act. And how do you plan to do that? Clara asked. Dylan hesitated, then said, with your help, but it'll require careful planning. Are you willing? There was a pause on the other end, but when Clara spoke, her voice carried a quiet determination. I said I'd help, Dylan. Let's do this. As the call ended, Dylan leaned back in his chair, a flicker of hope igniting in the darkness. Together, they would uncover the truth, no matter the cost. The late afternoon sun painted the Grayson estate in hues of amber, casting long shadows across the manicured lawns. Inside, the atmosphere was anything but serene. Dylan paced his office, the tension radiating from him palpable. Clara sat nearby, her arms crossed, watching him with a calm intensity that belied the storm brewing within her. We've set the trap, Dylan said, his voice more to himself than to her. Now we wait. It won't take long, Clara replied. Her tone was measured, confident. Jordan won't be able to resist. They had spent days piecing together a plan, using Dylan's resources and Clara's sharp intuition. Clara had planted false information about a lucrative deal that Dylan was supposedly finalizing, details tantalizing enough to lure out anyone with ulterior motives. The bait had been set, and now, all they needed was for Jordan to take it. As the sun dipped lower, casting the estate in a soft twilight, Jordan arrived, his presence as unassuming as ever. He greeted the staff with his usual charm, his polished demeanor betraying no hint of the duplicity Clara and Dylan suspected. Clara watched from the shadows as Jordan entered Dylan's office. Her heart pounded in her chest, but she forced herself to remain calm. This moment would decide everything. Dylan stood behind his desk, his expression neutral, as Jordan approached. "Jordan," he said, his voice steady, "I need you to review some details for the Cunningham deal." "Of course," Jordan replied smoothly, taking the folder Dylan offered. "Anything specific I should focus on?" "Just make sure everything aligns," Dylan said, his tone casual. "We can't afford any slip-ups." Jordan nodded, flipping through the pages with practiced ease. But as Dylan watched, he noted the subtle shift in Jordan's demeanor, the slight narrowing of his eyes, the faint hesitation in his movements. Jordan lingered too long on certain pages, his gaze sharpening as though memorizing the details. "Everything looks in order," Jordan said after a moment, closing the folder and placing it back on the desk. "Good," Dylan replied, keeping his expression unreadable. "I'll finalize it tomorrow." Jordan nodded, but as he turned to leave, Dylan called out, "Oh, and Jordan?" Jordan paused, glancing over his shoulder. "Yes?" Dylan smiled faintly. "Let's keep this between us for now. No need to alert anyone prematurely." Jordan's lips curved into a polite smile, but his eyes betrayed a flicker of something else. Calculation, perhaps. Understood. That night, Dylan and Clara gathered in the estate's security room, where a series of monitors displayed live footage from strategically placed cameras. They had outfitted Jordan's office with hidden surveillance, a move Dylan never thought he'd have to take against someone he had trusted for so long. As the clock ticked past midnight, their patience was rewarded. On one of the monitors, Jordan appeared, his movements furtive. He entered his office, glanced around to ensure he was alone, and then pulled out the folder Dylan had given him earlier. Clara leaned closer, her eyes narrowing as she watched him carefully photograph the documents with his phone. The evidence was undeniable. "He's sending it," Dylan said grimly, his voice low. They watched as Jordan typed rapidly on his phone, presumably forwarding the images to an outside contact. Clara's expression hardened. "He's the leak. All this time it was him." Dylan exhaled slowly, the weight of betrayal pressing down on him. He had known, deep down, but seeing it confirmed felt like a dagger to the heart. The next morning, Dylan summoned Jordan to the study. Clara stood in the corner, her presence silent but commanding. Jordan entered, his demeanor as polished as ever, but there was a flicker of unease in his eyes when he saw Clara. "Dylan," Jordan greeted, his voice smooth. "You wanted to see me?" "Sit," Dylan said, his tone leaving no room for argument. Jordan complied, glancing warily between Dylan and Clara. "What's this about?" Dylan leaned forward, resting his forearms on the desk. His gaze was sharp, cutting through Jordan's facade. "I want to talk about loyalty, Jordan. About trust." Jordan shifted in his seat, his smile faltering slightly. "I'm not sure I understand." "You will," Dylan said, sliding a tablet across the desk. On the screen was the footage of Jordan photographing the documents. "Explain this." Jordan's face paled, his usual composure slipping. He opened his mouth to speak, but no words came out. "Nothing to say?" Dylan asked, his voice cold. "You've been feeding information to Marks, haven't you?" "For months." Jordan swallowed hard, his gaze darting to Clara. "You can't seriously believe her over me." "This isn't about belief," Clara interjected, her voice calm but firm. "It's about proof, and we have it." Dylan stood, his presence towering over Jordan. "I trusted you," he said, his voice heavy with disappointment. "I let you into my world, my business, and you repaid me with betrayal." Jordan's mask of confidence crumbled. "I can explain," he stammered. It wasn't what it looked like. Don't insult my intelligence, Dylan snapped. You've been working against me, and now you'll face the consequences. After Jordan was escorted off the estate, Dylan and Clara sat in the quiet study, the tension finally beginning to ease. For the first time in weeks, Dylan felt a semblance of clarity. You were right, he said, breaking the silence. About everything. Clara glanced at him, her expression unreadable. I didn't want to be. Dylan nodded, his jaw tightening. I owe you more than an apology, Clara. I let my own fear cloud my judgment, and I hurt you in the process. Clara studied him for a long moment before replying. You'll have to do more than apologize, Dylan. Trust isn't rebuilt overnight. I know, he said quietly, but I'm willing to do whatever it takes. Clara's gaze softened slightly, though her resolve remained firm. Good, because this is just the beginning. As they sat in the quiet study, a tentative alliance forming between them, Dylan felt a flicker of hope. He had lost much, but perhaps with Clara's help, he could begin to rebuild. Not just his business, but the trust he had so carelessly broken. The first rays of dawn painted the Grayson estate in soft gold, the serenity of the morning belying the upheaval of the days prior. Inside the vast study, Dylan sat at his desk, the weight of his recent discoveries still pressing heavily on his shoulders. The betrayal by Jordan, the calculated manipulations by Elliot Marks, and the harsh realization of how he had wronged Clara, all of it had reshaped the once unshakable foundation of his life. Clara entered quietly, her footsteps soft on the polished hardwood floor. She carried herself with an understated strength, her presence commanding without demanding attention. Dylan looked up as she approached, his expression a mix of weariness and resolve. You called for me, Clara said, her tone measured but not cold. There was a guardedness in her voice, an understandable barrier that Dylan knew would take time to dismantle. I did, he replied, gesturing for her to sit. There are things I need to say, and things I need to ask. Clara remained standing for a moment, studying him. His posture was less rigid than usual, his gaze more vulnerable. Finally, she sat, folding her hands neatly in her lap. I'm listening. Dylan took a deep breath, his fingers tracing the edge of a folder on the desk. First, I want to apologize again, not just for doubting you, but for the way I handled everything. I let my paranoia get the best of me, and in doing so, I hurt you. That's not something I can undo, but I hope it's something I can make up for. Clara's expression softened slightly, though her eyes remained wary. Words are easy, Dylan. Actions are what matter. I know, he said quickly, and that's why I'm not asking for forgiveness yet. I'm asking for your help, not just to fix what's broken in my business, but to rebuild something stronger. Clara tilted her head slightly, curiosity flickering in her gaze. You think I want to come back after everything? I think, Dylan said carefully, that you care about this place, about the people here, and about doing what's right. And I think that's what sets you apart from everyone else who's ever worked for me. For a long moment, Clara said nothing, her eyes locked on his. Then, finally, she spoke. If I agree, it's on my terms. Name them, Dylan said without hesitation. Clara leaned forward slightly, her voice steady. No more keeping me in the dark. No more decisions made without consulting me. If you want me to help you rebuild, I need full transparency. And I need your trust. Dylan nodded, his expression solemn. You have it. Over the next few days, Clara immersed herself in the work of uncovering and repairing the damage Jordan had done. With her sharp eye for detail and intimate knowledge of the estate's operations, she quickly identified areas of vulnerability and began implementing safeguards to prevent future breaches. Dylan watched her work with a mixture of awe and regret, marveling at the depth of her capabilities and wondering how he could have ever doubted her. One afternoon, as Clara was poring over financial records in the estate's office, Dylan entered, carrying 2 cups of coffee. He set one beside her without a word and leaned against the edge of the desk. You've been at this for hours, he said, his tone lighter than usual. Do you ever take a break? Clara glanced up, a faint smile tugging at her lips. Do you? Dylan chuckled softly, the sound rare but genuine. Touché. They worked in companionable silence for a while, the tension that had once defined their interactions beginning to ease. As the hours passed, Dylan found himself appreciating not just Clara's efficiency, but her perspective, her ability to see beyond the obvious and find solutions he would have overlooked. "You're good at this," he said suddenly, breaking the quiet. Clara looked up, arching an eyebrow. "At what?" "At running things," Dylan replied. "At seeing what needs to be done and making it happen." She shrugged lightly. "I've had practice." "It's more than that," Dylan said, his gaze earnest. "You have a talent for leadership, for knowing what people need, even when they don't know it themselves." Clara's expression softened, but she quickly masked it with a wry smile. "Careful, Dylan. You might make me think you're trying to flatter me." "Maybe I am," he admitted, his tone playful but sincere. By the end of the week, the estate was beginning to return to its former rhythm, but with one significant difference. Clara was no longer just a member of the staff. Dylan had given her a position of authority, trusting her to oversee operations and ensure that the systems they were putting in place would protect against future betrayals. One evening, as they stood on the balcony overlooking the estate's sprawling grounds, Dylan turned to Clara. "Do you think we'll ever get back to normal?" Clara thought for a moment before replying. "Normal isn't the goal, Dylan. Better is." He nodded, her words resonating. "And do you think we're on the right track?" Clara glanced at him, her expression thoughtful. "We're getting there. But trust takes time, Dylan. You'll have to prove you've learned from all this." "I will," he said, his voice steady. "I promise." Clara smiled faintly, the first genuine smile he had seen from her in weeks. "Good. Because I'm holding you to that." As the sun dipped below the horizon, casting the estate in shades of amber and crimson, a sense of hope filled the air. Dylan and Clara stood side by side, two people who had been brought to the brink by betrayal and misunderstanding, but who had found their way back to something stronger, a fragile but genuine alliance. And for the first time in a long time, Dylan believed that the future, though uncertain, held the promise of redemption.